The Life of Borodin, Russian composer. The next time you listen to Borodin, which I don't know how many people are actually listening to Borodin. I could play some Borodin on stream. I just might get copyright striked, and I don't want to do that on my VODs for this particular thing, because I post these on YouTube. The next time you listen to Borodin, remember he was just a chemist who wrote music to relax. His house was jammed with people, students, artists, drunkards, bums, and he never knew how to say no. The next time you listen to Borodin, remember his wife used his compositions to line the cat boxes with, or to cover jars of sour milk. She had asthma and insomnia and fed him soft-boiled eggs. And when he wanted to cover his head, to hide out the sounds of the house, she only allowed him to use the sheet. Besides, there was usually somebody in his bed. They slept separately when they slept at all. Insomnia, and he's a chemist and composer, I suppose. And since all the chairs were usually taken, he often slept on the stairway, wrapped in an old shawl. She told him when to cut his nails, not to sing or whistle, or to put too much lemon in his tea, or to press it with a spoon. Symphony No. 2 in B minor, Prince Igor. In the steppes of Central Asia, he could sleep only by putting a piece of dark cloth over his eyes. In 1887, he attended a dance at the Medical Academy. Dressed in a merrymaking national costume, at least he seemed exceptionally gay, and when he fell to the floor, they thought he was clowning. The next time you listen to Borodin, remember. Okay. Well, in that case, I would love to know if that's, like, referring to his death. Because if it is, that sounds sort of tragic. And, well, we know Bukowski's a fan of tragedy and sad things and not the happiest poet. So, something to research. But not quite yet. There is so much to go through. In a sense, I want my house in the future, first impressions, to be like Borodin's house. Students, artists, drunkards, bums, letting people in, having my home, like live in a freaking, like, house in California and let anyone in the door. That's how I want to live my life. Anyway, let's read it again. You can never read a poem too many times when you're trying to figure out what it means, right? So, the next time you listen to Borodin, remember he was just a chemist who wrote music to relax. His house jammed with people, students, artists, drunkards, bums, and he never knew how to say no. Hey, Nashinoka, welcome to stream. I'm glad you're here. I remember you from the reading stream of the guy who was reading Poe. I'm glad to have you in my chat. We are RoboEdit. I'm reading some Charles Bukowski, who is a more modern American poet, and doing so by candlelight. So this poem is The Life of Borodin. And it's a lot of fun. And I'm just starting, so I'm gonna read through the poem again and then start actually doing some analysis, and you'll kind of see how it goes. I'm really glad to have you in chat, though. That makes you if you would like to be one of my good girls, as you can see on stream. Anyway, the life of Borodin. The next time you listen to Borodin, remember he was just a chemist who wrote music to relax. Okay, I'm gonna hold that thought. I'm gonna have the pen out for underlining purposes. I'll do purple for just things that stand out. So, he wrote music to relax. His house was jammed with people, students, artists, drunkards, bums, and he never knew how to say no. The next time you listen to Borodin, remember his wife used his compositions to line the cat boxes with, or to cover jars of sour milk. She had asthma and insomnia and fed him soft-boiled eggs, and when he wanted to cover his head, to hide out the sounds of the house, she only allowed him to use the sheet. Besides, there was usually somebody in his bed. They slept separately when they slept at all. And since all the chairs were usually taken, he often slept on the stairway, wrapped in an old shawl. She told him when to cut his nails, not to sing or whistle, or to put too much lemon in his tea, or press it with a spoon. Symphony No. 2 in B minor, Prince Igor. In the steppes of Central Asia. He could sleep only by putting a piece of dark cloth over his eyes. In 1887, he attended a dance at the Medical Academy, dressed in a merrymaking national costume. At last, he seemed exceptionally gay, and when he fell to the floor, they thought he was clowning. The next time you listen to Borodin, remember. So, I want to look up the circumstances of Borodin's death. Oh, I should put on my... Should I also put on my ring light? No, I think we like the candlelight. Maybe just for some more... I don't know. If I did red, it might look good. That's purple. It's a little much. That's changing colors. Yeah, if I do red, it keeps the warm feeling and gives us a little more light. I think I like that. So, I'm gonna grab my iPad, the main device of mine, and look up Borodin, composer and chemist. So, he's a romantic Russian composer. Alexander Porfiryevich Borodin. Georgian Russian extraction, okay. Yep, one of the five. So the five were the best Russian composers, or not best, but an important sort of clique, and that's Balakirev, Kuy, Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, and Borodin. All excellent composers. Rimsky-Korsakov wrote, I believe, Carnival of the Animals. Mussorgsky wrote Pictures at an Exhibition. I'm honestly less familiar with these two, right? Rimsky-Korsakov. Oh, Scheherazade, right. Is his composition of note. Anyway. Name. It's interesting. Mr. Balakirov. Oh, that's the five stuff. Okay. Personal life. Born in St. Petersburg. Illegitimate son of a 62-year-old nobleman. Okay. And Okay, great start for an artist. 25-year-old Russian woman and a 62-year-old nobleman. She was married. Okay. Due to the circumstances of his birth, okay, he was registered under a serf. Interesting. So he went to medical school, whatever, ended up as a chemist. He is on the Russian 1 ruble coin from 1993. It's kind of cool. Very pretty. In his profession, great respect, worked on aldehydes. Lovely. Reactions musical, avocation. 1862. He wrote Symphony in E flat major, performed 7 years later. That's interesting. So 1877, which is the same year mentioned, no, 10 years before that. Wrote some stuff in the steppes of Central Asia. So that's a different piece. Not too much information there. And then he had Prince Igor and the Symphony, number 2. Nothing particularly important seems. Prince Igor, is that a completed posthumously by Rimsky-Korsakov and Glazunov. I love Alexander Glazunov. Sure. And is that a opera or a ballet? Opera. Chamber music. Absolute music. Interestingly, so he wrote absolute music. Oh, RoboEdit. Hello, welcome. I'm glad to see you here too. Both you and Nashi. That's really awesome. So we are learning about Borodin right now, and reading because we are reading Bukowski, Life of Borodin by candlelight. It's very lovely. You're summoned. Gotcha. Musical legacy. When did he die? When did this guy die? Here we go. Taking lessons in 1862. Cholera, heart failures, suddenly died at a ball, the academy. And it doesn't say much more than that. Hold on. He established medical courses for women in 1872. Dude, that's sick. So he died 1887, yeah. You were summoned by Robo. Well, so not too much on Wikipedia about Borodin, but his death so we get an extremely short career as a composer. Extreme stress, wife's health was bad, his health was bad. Borodin was invited to a ball. He was wearing Russian national dress. So very nicely dressed, high spirits, very happy, started to feel unwell. Speaking indistinctly, tongue was numb, seemed to be swaying, so perhaps thought he was clowning, drunk, and he collapsed to the floor. Every doctor was there, and he died. And there is no more to it than that. Oh, post-mortem, burst artery in the heart. So I think even if this doctor applied bleeding care, Borodin would not have lived. However, that is extremely... He also struck his temple against the corner, causing a hemorrhage in the brain. Death could have occurred any time with his heart condition. Large crowd at the funeral. Buried next to Mussorgsky. That's really cool. And then Rimsky-Korsakov, Glazunov published his symphony, Prince Igor, or his opera, right? Opera. Wow. Extremely tragic. Impressive that his career, or he became so well known, even given his short career and unfortunate circumstances of death. I wonder if Borodin, this is just a thought, does Bukowski relate to Borodin? We've talked about Bukowski being the stereotypical tortured artist. He also spent time working while doing poetry on the side, or art on the side in that sense, and had issues with wives. Not that this is the same kind of thing. Bukowski was sort of the problem in his relationships. And those such things. Borodin putting art and work at the forefront. But let's start to dive in and do some analysis. I find the last line fascinating, and it might take some time to get there. So, in the middle of this poem, he just writes Symphony No. 2 in B minor, Prince Igor, in the Steppes of Central Asia, which are just 3 of his pieces. These, Prince Igor was posthumous. These 2 he did publish. But it seems just honestly strange to put those there as like something of note. A interesting standout. We'll do that in kind of red. Also put that in the wrong place. It's no worries. So the next time you listen to Borodin, remember he was just a chemist who wrote music to relax. So this could immediately be saying something like, realize that he creates this incredible art not as a profession, but out of love and as a hobby. I'm starting to think, Nico, hello, how are you? I hope all is well. It's Bukowski time, by candlelight this time. And we're reading the life of Borodin. And immediately I'm wondering if we're going to look back at the last poems, because he writes about... So, I think I really love the organization of this book already. I think there's a lot of really good intent, or intention in it coming from this scholar. Because this talks about Borodin and how he relates to music as a hobby and to something he did in his free time. You'll be back. Have a good one, Nashi. Appreciate your being here. In the previous poem, Layover, I think he's referring to art not being possible as a hobby. The dichotomy of work and art is what we talked about. And then he also talks about, like, his sort of resentment for art. So it's immediately looking analyzing all these different relations to art that Bukowski might have or see, which is interesting. His house was jammed with people, students, artists, drunkards, bums. He never knew how to say no. He never knew how to say no. I already said, but this is how I want my house to be. I want to provide a haven for artists and drunkards and bums. Maybe he sees Borodin as a foil in that sense. Bukowski was the drunkard, the bum, the artist. Borodin was in some sense successful, but he also died. Remember, his wife used his compositions to line the cat boxes with or to cover jars of sour milk. She had asthma and insomnia and fed him soft-boiled eggs. So I have to wonder, use blue for like questions, maybe whether this is sort of like a controlling parental type thing, or maternal parentalism control, and not really like believing in Borodin's ability to care for himself, but I'm not certain. When he wanted to cover his head to hide out the sounds of the house, she only allowed him to use the sheet. Right, again, she's like sort of treating him poorly, maybe. And again, I wonder if Bukowski relates to, or is trying to relate or interject or create wife issues, because Bukowski did romance really bad. But wife issues, right? Besides, there was usually somebody in his bed. They slept separately, when they slept at all. Insomnia and working and writing and loud house. Since all the chairs were usually taken, he often slept on the stairway. Painting perhaps a picture of generosity. Wrapped in an old shawl, she told him when to cut his nails, not to sing or whistle or put too much lemon in his tea or press it with a spoon. Symphony No. 2 in B minor, Prince Igor, in the steppes of Central Asia. I wonder if it first depicted all of the, I suppose, bad things about his life, as to show in this line how incredible it was that these pieces were created. Just to list them is very impactful. So you have like bad stuff, bad, hard, life, right? And then you just say huge accomplishment. Perhaps as to show that this composer, this artist, was incredible in what he did. He could sleep only by putting a piece of dark cloth over his eyes. In 1887, he attended a dance at the Medical Academy, dressed in a merrymaking national costume, as we read online as well. At last, he seemed exceptionally gay, and when he fell to the floor, they thought he was clowning. The next time you listen to Borodin, remember. I think this is exaggerated based on the actual story, but I'm sure that means Bukowski has a point. I also think it's funny that they say gay and clowning. And now, like, we would say that someone is clowning, being clowned on. And obviously we use gay for people like me. So, it's just kind of funny. Choose them both together. The Life of Borodin. Interesting that this is the life of Borodin, but it's the life of Borodin starting when he was writing music. There's no childhood, and he had a really interesting childhood. He had a childhood where he was a bastard son and a serf of the Lord who had him as a bastard son. The Lord, like, kind of still cared for him, and because of that, he was able to go to school and become a chemist. At which point, he then became one of the most notable composers in Russia, which during the Romantic period, and really always, had just an absolutely mind-boggling musical and artistic output. I think particularly the Russian musicians are absolutely incredible. But he didn't include any of this. I'm wondering how much more there is to this poem. I'm mostly wondering about his wife. And this idea at the end, they thought he was clowning. Because they were all doctors, they did try to save him. And Bukowski would have known that. He clearly appreciates Borodin. He says the next time you listen to Borodin, so he thinks people listen to Borodin a lot. Maybe they were at the time, but fairly convinced he was probably a Borodin fan. Tended a dance. An interesting line also. At last, he seemed exceptionally good. At last, presumably referring to the prior pain / hard life, which we talked about there and there. Right. Hulk Hogan. Hello. I appreciate the real Hulk Hogan being in my chat. How are you doing today? I personally am doing quite well. I'm doing some reading by candlelight of Charles Bukowski, his poem The Life of Borodin. I'm quite enjoying it. We've been doing Bukowski analysis for 3 streams before this, in many colors and diagrams and such things. One thing to note is I often have viewers send me their writing to analyze. I really love analyzing work, so if y'all have any, there's like a contact link. It's just like linked onto the image down in my about. I'd be super happy to read anyone's stuff if you all are writers. Or if you just have suggestions for things for me to analyze. But regardless, to keep trying to sort out what Bukowski is saying, mostly what he thinks about his life, and this part at the end. I wonder if this is to say blue for questions and wondering. Only after he found joy, and when he found joy, only after he found joy, but also at that moment, is when he died. Like, the existence of an artist must be tortured. Perhaps as to say that great art comes from suffering, or suffering enables great art. This would make sense as something for Charles Bukowski to write and think. I say that because Charles Bukowski was tortured. Charles Bukowski wrote incredible art. Charles Bukowski probably in that sense looked for other artists like him. And Borodin has a pretty terrible story. Maybe. Of course, Charles Bukowski is dead, Borodin is dead. We cannot really assume. But maybe also this is saying something about, like the phrase, the brightest candle / light / flame. That quote, the brightest candle burns the quickest, burning fast, burning bright. Which makes sense. This short career. He wasn't young when he died. He was accomplished in both of these things, but he died younger than others would have, perhaps younger than he should have, if we were to want to make judgments on how long people ought to live. Maybe all people ought to live longer than they do. Who knows? Regardless, he also ends with, the next time you listen to Borodin, remember, ... He trails off. What do I think he means when he talks about trailing off? Also, I still want to look at some of the wife stuff. So box that. I'm using red for like questions. Well, red for maybe things that confuse me. Could have ended here with his death, but Bukowski decides to add, as the only thing separate, the next time you listen to Borodin, remember, ellipsis. No other ellipses in this poem, so this is like entirely unique. The punctuation, that is. And another punctuation thing is there is no period until the end, with the exception of no, but that is something that Borodin did not know how to say. The thing that Borodin did not know how to say was no period. And then we have semicolons, semicolons, no spacing, semicolon, comma, period only when he dies. Bukowski seems to really like punctuation based on his other poems, and you always have to assume, as a rule, assume intentionality. In a poem. If any of y'all send me things to read, I assume that everything you do is intentional unless you say something like, I'm sending this poem and the punctuation is sloppy and bad, which my girlfriend did. I read it on stream, it was still great. And that being said, it is extraordinarily intentional that the period is upon his death. Also no capitalization, except for his pieces and the Medical Academy. Which makes sense, right? It might just be to say that's the punctuation of his life, the end, that's all. He also might be trying to imply something about his life, that it never stopped. He worked hard. He worked himself to death, maybe. Maybe. Worked himself to death. And created Symphony No. 2, Prince Igor, and In the Steppes of Central Asia, 3 incredible compositions, amongst other pieces. String quartets, symphonies, 1 or 2 other symphonies. At least 1 other symphony. There was a Symphony 1. And that being said, if we look at poem number 1, friendly advice to a lot of young men and a lot of old men too. But don't write any more poetry. Is the end of this poem. Break your head in with a hatchet. Live in a barrel, but don't write any more poetry. Layover. It talks about making art. And then the end of that. And where does that art go? The sparrow. I pass upon death and nothing to my next of kin. I hate it as an artist. So, you might ask whether this is a warning. Perhaps that's an interpretation. In that sense, a lot of Bukowski's poems are warnings. Or, not in that sense, but I feel like so far they are. And that would certainly make sense, consistency-wise, to warn the reader not to do art. That it does this to your life. Next time you listen to Borodin, remember, ... leaving it now open to your life. Remember something else. Remember this poem. Remember that art is painful and it's this addiction, and that the more you do it, the more you're going to suffer, and you'll work yourself to death. Seems like a very Bukowski, a very consistent interpretation of Bukowski with what we've read so far. I wonder if there's a way to take this in a different direction. It's always hard for me and something I need to work on. I think black is for like larger notes on analysis. take things in a new direction. And that is to say, try to interpret this poem differently. Because it's easy to get stuck in your first impression and not change your mind, and that's no good. Even if you were maybe right, not that there's a right interpretation, but there are many interpretations of this poem, of any poem, of my poems, of your poems. And that being said, it's good exercise to try to interpret this a different way. I'm not sure immediately, but if anyone has ideas or comments on how else this might be interpreted, I would greatly appreciate it. I love y'all talking in chat and being good girls and boys. But the next time you listen to Borodin, remember he was a chemist who wrote music to relax. Decided to be outside today. Poetry at Paparotti and then Ferguson's downtown. Hey, that's awesome. Being out and about is good. I had therapy this morning, and I'm playing D&D tonight. Have fun with Stream Ginny. Have fun with your things, Nico. I appreciate you stopping in always. And I'm glad you could catch some Bukowski. I know you enjoy it. So have a good one. Yeah. We could also look at the video from What's-Her-Name on YouTube, who has a series going through this whole book, actually. Just some random person on YouTube. I'm also posting mine. The first one is up on YouTube. But that could help us get a new perspective. Otherwise, I can just figure it out. So, he wrote music to relax. Perhaps this could be commenting on, like, I don't know. We know that often Bukowski is sort of an unreliable narrator, and in a sense his poems want us to judge the things he's saying. Although this is specifically written to be biographical, so I'm not sure about taking it in that direction. But it could be something. As to say that we don't trust what Bukowski says, which that might be the start here. They thought he was clowning. That's not true. That's an exaggeration. Maybe this depiction of his wife was much more positive. Maybe this is an exaggeration that she was throwing out his compositions. I'm not going to look at that. We can look afterward. But then that is to say, his art wasn't an intense thing. He was a successful man who wrote music to enjoy things. To enjoy for fun, not like Bukowski, who suffers. Like, maybe one way to interpret a Bukowski poem is to interpret it as everything he says is a lie. So his house was jammed with people and he never knew how to say no. Maybe he just was a kind and accepting person with a caring wife. They were both struggling, sure, but that's beyond their control. He slept in the stairway. I don't know. Maybe that's not so bad. And he wrote incredible pieces. That doesn't change in this interpretation. And he attended a dance and was happy and died, unfortunately. It's still a tragedy. I use a different color for this conclusion. Maybe pink. It's a tragedy, of course. And a narrative that maybe Bukowski is, in a sense, twisting for his own sort of need to be accepted in this regard, need to relate to another artist. So at that point, I would say that Bukowski how would I even begin to write that down coherently? Bukowski is showing us a vision of this tragedy that is false. As to say that the artist doesn't need to suffer. If you interpret all of this as care, which it all is, which Bukowski was so abysmally bad at, like maybe Bukowski, Charles, doesn't understand care. And the start of this interpretation of not trusting Bukowski is saying that, well, this isn't true. I didn't think he was clowning, as far as I can tell, from my knowledge. Borodin just died, unfortunately. And maybe that's all. But I think I will, now that we've looked into that, look at Borodin's relationship, if there's any information on his wife. Borodin wife. So she is Ekaterina Protopopova. There is a Dallas Symphony Orchestra artist notes, which is good. They tend to be pretty accurate. Not only a brilliant scientist, tender and gentle-natured, spoke multiple languages, very much a prodigy. So he was writing early. Studied chemistry, etc. He married pianist Ekaterina Protopopova and got his doctorate in chemistry. Wrote in his spare time. Balakirev, Korsakov, Rimsky-Korsakov, Kui, and Mussorgsky, the Five, the Russian Five. Known for Igor and his symphony. Nothing particularly notable about his life, but he married a musician. They have children. He had no children. Their marriage was happy, but this is not necessarily a credible source. Let's see. Borodin, Steps, Igor, string quartet mentioned. Okay. who was coping with both him and his wife's failing health, passed away from heart failure at 54, which isn't necessarily young for the time, but he could have lived longer. Let's see. Here's some references. Borodin from BBC. It's very fun to research the background of the poems, and that in this case means researching Borodin. Anything about his life. Full-time professor. Founders of the School of Medicine for Women. And women make up an unusually high proportion of doctors in Russia to this day. Brilliant and fascinating personality. Cheerful. Witty. Humming tunes. Juggled music and chemistry at the same time. This is obviously a glowing review. Called himself a Sunday composer. Very funny. He is often used as a shelter or a night's lodging by poor visiting people who pick that place to fall ill or lose their minds. Borodin had their hands full with them, took them to hospitals. Sofas and floors were turned into beds. He didn't compose when guests were around, because he might wake them. That looks like care to me, more than destitution. But again, this is written by somebody. So that's an interesting perspective on Borodin. Borodin on Classical Net. Died of heart failure, having a good time at the party. So again, he was a very, positive person. Borodin, I don't think, lived the life that Bukowski wants us to think he did. And so maybe it's a bit tragic that Bukowski himself would write this poem, this tragic poem. Okay, Tchaikovsky research, that seems pretty legit. Probably Russian music sort of journal type thing. Oh, this is excellent. Okay. Nothing much about his death. Deprived him of time for music and his health. Died. Biography. Sciencey stuff. So, I'm fairly certain, based on all of this, that Borodin was in no way living a life that one should pity. Was in no way this person destitute. It seems like he was completely devoted And perhaps Bukowski sees that devotion as a negative thing. Bukowski sees art oftentimes as a negative thing as an artist. Bukowski likes to be a hypocrite, and Bukowski is not very good at treating people well. So perhaps we take this in the direction of saying that this poem is an example of an incredible artist, but not remember him for his music in spite of his life, but remember him for, in its entirety, how incredible of a person he was, and how incredible it was that he could write this music and provide so much care, and have a wife and people, and care for those who couldn't care for themselves. And sure, he couldn't say no. He couldn't say no to art, he couldn't say no to work, he couldn't say no to people. And Bukowski doesn't seem to like that. Perhaps Bukowski is similar, not able to say no to his art, and thus hurting people. Perhaps Bukowski is not similar. He does say no. He does push people away. Bukowski is not as caring as Borodin. Maybe Bukowski sees Borodin as a better man than himself. But regardless, Bukowski relates to him enough to write a poem about him, and a very intentional, very powerful biographical poem. So, we have two interpretations now. A history to remember his music in spite of, and a history to celebrate alongside his music. A warning against the consuming nature of art and life and passion, or an inspiring example of the places art can take you. Because this was the 1800s. He died at 56. That's not that young. And maybe Bukowski had an incredible artistic output, as far as I know. Borodin did not. Perhaps Bukowski, as we know, being kind of material in other points of his life, being poor, being someone very worldly in that regard, envies someone like Borodin, who can write little, do many things, succeed, temper the obsession, or have multiple. Because Bukowski warns us against doing art. Bukowski sees this as tragic. Bukowski sees it as a bad thing to become consumed by creation. It's the first poem in this book. So of course Bukowski is going to take Borodin's life as a negative thing. And so I think this is a reminder, as a general rule, take things in a new direction and question the poet. maybe the big lessons for today. Because I feel much happier with this poem, knowing that at an underlying level there is positivity in this story. And it's also kind of sad that Bukowski couldn't see it. I'm not saying I'm better than Bukowski or that I'm seeing things that he can't see. Well, I am, but I'm no better for it. That's important to know. So, that's The Life of Borodin by Charles Bukowski. And I'll be reading more Bukowski next time I do poetry on stream. And now we're going to move on to something else. I'm not sure what. But certainly not more Bukowski. A little look ahead. Next time we're reading When Hugo Wolf Went Mad. I'm not sure who that is, but it talks about writing songs, so maybe it's another composer. And that is for next time.